Ever since his rise to power in the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler, the Führer, had exuded supreme outward self-confidence. His ability to inspire the German people to follow him was legendary. Even during the Second World War, when things had gone badly, his self-belief remained totally intact. But throughout the war, his relationship with the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, the OKW, or Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, had become progressively more difficult. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, comprised three elements. The first was the Heer, the army. The second element was the navy, or Kriegsmarine. And finally there was the Luftwaffe, the air force. Back in 1935, Hitler had repudiated the Treaty of Versailles. The reparations that Germany had to pay following the First World War were a major contribution to German resentment in the 1920s and the rise of the Nazi Party. An immediate program of rearmament began, always under the Führer's ever-watchful eye. As he stated, "Before the war, when I saw that the army could not be induced to take any steps towards motorization, I went myself to Krupp's and arranged that the SS unit should be equipped with a Panzer Mark IV. By 1944, the Heer had over 9 million men under arms. This included the 910,000 men of the Waffen-SS. The SS, the Schutzstaffel, or Protective Squadron, was an organ of the Nazi Party, and therefore under Hitler's direct control. In 1934, the Führer directed the formation of the SS Verfangenstruppe, or Special Purpose Troops, as the combat arm of the party. In the spring of 1941, they became the Waffen-SS. The Waffen-SS fought under their own officers and commanders. Though never formally part of the Wehrmacht, they did, however, fight under army command. Matching the rise in strength of the army in the 1930s and 40s was the Kriegsmarine, where a huge shipbuilding program had provided Germany with a major surface and submarine fleet. Again, Hitler's input before September 1939 was clear. "Should there be a war, I shall build U-boats, I shall build aeroplanes, and annihilate my enemies." By 1944, however, the supremacy of Allied naval and air power had largely defeated the U-boat menace and destroyed or bottled up the remaining German Navy's surface competence. Before the repudiation of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not permitted an air force. However, during the 1930s, the rise of the Luftwaffe was as great as that of the Army and Navy. Starting with biplane fighters, modern single-wing fighters and bombers were developed. This had given Germany a clear early advantage over the Allied air forces. However, America's entry into the war had helped turn the tide. By 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, with heavy losses mounting rapidly. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of War Production and a long-term confidant of Hitler, was under immense pressure to maintain aircraft production. But Germany's aircraft plants were now under almost constant air attack. Each of the services had their own command structure. In the summer of 1944, command of the army was split between the Eastern and anticipated Western Front. The main formation facing the Russians in the east was Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Ernst Busch. He would shortly be replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt was Commander-in-Chief West. A dignified and aristocratic Prussian, he had been educated in one of Germany's strict elite military academies. He had served as a staff officer in the First World War. After 1918, Gerd von Rundstedt was steadily promoted in the new Reichswehr. By 1938, he was commander of the Second Army, occupying the Sudetenland, when he retired aged 63. 4 years later, Hitler persuaded him to come out of retirement with the view of strengthening the German defences in the West in the face of an expected invasion by the Western Allies. Von Rundstedt particularly despised the OKW, its chief of staff, Wilhelm Keitel, which did not make for a successful relationship. This may have been one of the reasons that von Rundstedt at first did little to fortify the Atlantic coast. By the autumn of 1943, little or no emplacements had been built. It wasn't until Generalfeldmarschall Edwin Rommel's appointment as von Rundstedt's subordinate that the vast building program to create the static defences of France and the Low Countries was begun in earnest. Head of the Kriegsmarine was Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. He had joined the Imperial German Navy in 1910 and had seen action in surface ships and submarines during the First World War. In the last year of the war, Karl Dönitz's U-boat was sunk and he was held prisoner by the British on Malta. After his release in 1919, he served in the naval arm of the Weimar Republic's Reichswehr. During 1935, he was appointed as commander of the 1st U-boat flotilla Weddigen of the fledgling Kriegsmarine, and in early 1939 became commander of submarines. In January 1943, Karl Dönitz replaced Grand Admiral Erich Raeder as Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. Raeder had resigned after a series of failed surface operations, combined with the outstanding success of the U-boat fleet led by Dönitz, which had so nearly starved Britain into submission. For the remainder of the war, Dönitz continued to prosecute the naval war against the Allies, but with ever-decreasing resources. Reichsmarschall Göring commanded the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring was one of Hitler's oldest comrades, having been with him in the Munich Putsch of 1923. He had been a fighter ace in the First World War and had supported Hitler throughout the long years in political exile. In the early years of the Nazi government, he also gave the Führer a much-needed gloss of respectability with the German aristocracy. Incredible as it may seem, the heads of the Army, Navy and Air Force only really met on ceremonial duties and hardly ever in conference. When they did, Hitler was always present and in control. Military planning was in reality the responsibility of Hitler and a small military court on whose loyalty Hitler could depend. The OKW were to be mere messenger boys, with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel as Chief of Staff and General Alfred Jodl as Chief of Operations Staff. Their role was solely to add the details to the plans handed down by the Führer and pass them on to the various subcommands. At the beginning of the war, the OKW had an input into military planning. But after the campaigns in 1940, they lost any semblance of being a think tank for future Wehrmacht operations. Hitler's lasting contempt for the OKW was summed up by his view of them as these stuffed shirt gentlemen in their red striped trousers. And he made his intentions clear when he stated, "It is the General Staff I'm after. It is intolerable to me that a group of intellectuals should presume to press their views on their superiors. But such is the General Staff system, and that system I intend to smash. Hitler felt his attitude to the OKW was fully justified. The generals wanted to fight a war their way, but this was not the way the Führer demanded. And he had a good argument in his favour. Every time the generals had prophesied failure between 1935 and 1939, Hitler had been proved right, and they had been proved wrong. The complete integration of the Wehrmacht was also compounded by the bitter personal rivalry of the commanders of the three services, and particularly between the Navy and Air Force, which persisted throughout the war. For some reason, Hitler could never bring himself to sweep away the system of the independent service commands and centralize the whole Wehrmacht command setup. During the First World War, Wilhelm Keitel had served in the artillery, and later on with the German General Staff. After the armistice of 1918, he stayed on in the newly created Reichswehr, and in 1935 was promoted to Generalleutnant, commanding the Armed Forces Office. Hitler once described Keitel as having the brains of a cinema usher, and his fellow officers referred to him as the little lackey. Throughout the war, the Führer was constantly looking for a yes man to be the army's new chief of staff, but only found one at the end of March 1945 when all was lost. One might suggest that the task was not made any easier by the OKW's attempts to preserve the status quo. Though nominally head of the Wehrmacht, Keitel exercised little real control over the prosecution of the war, and it was up to Jodl to direct the operations. When Alfred Jodl first met Hitler in September 1939, he had fallen under the Führer's spell. Coming from a German military family, he had served as an artillery officer during the First World War and had married into a German aristocratic family. Like Keitel, Alfred Jodl was a career officer, and after 1918 remained in the army and was involved in the Austrian Anschluss of 1938. He was assessed by one Allied commander as the able clerk to the chief clerk. One of his senior officers noted that he suffered from an almost pathological personal ambition. It may have been this trait which attracted him to Hitler. Jodl had bitter experience of Hitler's anger following the disasters in southern Russia during the summer of 1942. There were even rumors that Hitler planned to replace him. He therefore deliberately kept his better judgment subordinate to his faith in Hitler's military genius and his fear of dismissal. Considering the fractious relationships between Hitler and most of his other generals, it is remarkable that both Keitel and Jodl remained in their posts throughout the war, up to the fall of Berlin in 1945. The beginning of June 1944 saw Hitler's long-term strategy for domination of Europe and establishing his 1,000-year Reich in tatters. Long gone were the heady days of 1940 when the German Blitzkrieg had swept all before it across Western Europe. The great victories of the Wehrmacht in the East in the summer of 1941 against the Soviet Union were now a distant memory. To the south, Italy, Germany's Axis partner, had been invaded. Hitler had been forced to rush German reinforcements south, and these were now engaged against the Allied armies battling up the boot of Italy. Italy's fascist leader, Benito Mussolini, was at risk of being overthrown. In the East, there were worrying signs of greater cooperation between the Soviets and the Western Allies. In shuttle bombing missions, American flying fortresses had been temporarily based in the recaptured Ukraine. From here, they were able to attack German defenses during the massive Russian summer offensive. This was timed to coincide with the American, British and Canadian landings on D-Day. Hitler long anticipated that the Western Allies would attempt to invade France and had ordered the construction of the much vaunted Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall was part of the overall concept of Fortress Europe, stretching from Norway in the north to the Franco-Spanish border in the south. Harbours were fortified and bomb-proof pens built for the Navy's U-boats. Along the coast of Western Europe, the defences comprised miles and miles of barbed wire, trenches, anti-tank ditches, gun emplacements and bunkers. Thousands upon thousands of tons of concrete were used in their construction. Many thousands of underwater obstacles were built and millions of mines laid. Labour was provided by the Todt organization, using thousands of local civilian conscripts and slave labourers from the countries of conquered Europe. Earlier, in the 1930s, to protect their western border, the Germans had constructed the impressive but totally inadequate defences of the West Wall, or Siegfried Line. This was the second and final major static defence line of Fortress Europe. As the Allied invasion of France and the Low Countries progressed, this was reinforced to further protect the fatherland. Inter-service rivalry made some operations of the Atlantic Wall's defences difficult. Anti-aircraft defences were a particular problem, as Rommel discovered. He knew from his experience in the desert that the superb 8.8 centimetre anti-aircraft gun could be used effectively in the anti-tank role. He wanted to reposition a large number of batteries between the rivers Orne and Veer. But Göring obstinately objected, insisting they remain in their existing positions in an anti-aircraft role. The Führer was aware of the huge concentration of Allied troops in Britain. "Obviously, an Anglo-American invasion in the West is going to come," he stated in March 1944. The invasion of his Fortress Europe was indeed imminent and would certainly be on the coast of France. All that was missing was the time, and more importantly, the exact place. Von Rundstedt believed the invasion would come in the area of the Pas de Calais, the shortest distance between France and England. Rommel agreed, but also considered the Allies might strike further west, in Normandy. Whichever location proved correct, one major problem was where to position the vital German armoured reserves to best counterattack the enemy. Both von Rundstedt and General de Panzertruppe Georg von Scheppenburg, commanding Panzer Group West, believed that they should be held back well in the rear. When the Allied landing plans became clear, the tanks could be rushed forward to oppose any expansion of the beachhead. Erwin Rommel, the desert fox of North Africa fame and a master of tank warfare, thought differently. He favoured deploying the German armoured reserves just over 10 miles from the coast, just out of naval gunfire range. Any further back, he argued, and Allied air power would prevent them from getting to the beaches. From his proposed forward positions, they could immediately counterattack the landings themselves. In fact, on the early morning of the 7th of June, one German tank officer on a night reconnaissance in a Kubelwagen actually ran into an unexploded 14-inch naval shell in the middle of the road. The Führer was asked to adjudicate, and for once, not sure which option to take, chose an unworkable compromise. In late April, he ordered the reserves placed in the middle, far enough inland to be useless to Rommel, but not far enough away for von Rundstedt. Hitler had, however, ordered that the enemy's invasion operation must not, under any circumstances, be allowed longer than hours or at most days. Once defeated, the enemy will never again try to invade. Against orders, Rommel did advance some of the armoured formations as far forward as he dared, ordering the 84th Corps, defending the Normandy sector, to move its reserves into the front line. Forward deployment of Panzer divisions was vital to Rommel's plans for a successful defence of the coast. In June 1944, the Panzer Division had changed substantially from its Blitzkrieg heyday. Though the division's strength had increased dramatically, shortages of men and equipment had in reality made this paper strength largely nominal. Still at the heart of the division was the Panzer Regiment, the tanks, the Panzer Grenadier Brigade, the infantry support for the armour, the Divisional Motorized Artillery Regiment, and the Reconnaissance Battalion. In 1941, the makeup of a Panzer regiment consisted of a headquarters company of 5 Panzerkampfwagen 4s and 3 battalions of armour. Each battalion had its own headquarters company, again with 5 Panzer 4s, as well as 3 tank companies. One company comprised 22 Panzer 4s, and the other 2 companies fielded 22 of the older Panzer 3s. Total strength was 86 tanks, 44 Panzer 3s and 42 Panzer 4s. By 1944, at full establishment, the regiment still comprised a headquarters company, now with 5 Panzer 4s and 3 Panthers. The number of tank battalions had been reduced from 3 to 2. Each battalion still had its own headquarters company, with 5 Panzer IVs and 3 Panthers. The 1st Battalion comprised 4 tank companies, all with Panthers. The 2nd Battalion also consisted of 4 companies, but now using the older Panzer IVs. Total strength was 200 tanks, 103 Panzer IVs and 97 Panthers. The Panzer Grenadier Brigade of 1941 comprised 2 regiments, each of 2 battalions of 5 companies. The infantry were carried in motorized transports. Grenadiers' own artillery was towed anti-tank infantry and light flak pieces. Their support weapons were light and heavy machine guns and mortars. By 1944, the brigade still comprised 2 regiments, each of 2 battalions, but now had only 4 companies to a battalion. Each battalion now also had Hummel self-propelled artillery in support. At least the whole of the 1st Battalion was mounted in armoured half-tracks, predominantly the SDKFZ 251. The 2nd Battalion was still largely motorized. Their support weapons were now greater numbers of light and heavy machine guns and heavier mortars. The Grenadiers were also now equipped with a recoilless Panzerschreck anti-tank launcher, similar to the American bazooka. And they also had the Panzerfaust one-shot throwaway anti-tank weapon. They were supported by a Pioneer Battalion, equipped with 24 flamethrowers and light and heavy mortars. The makeup of the 1941 Artillery Regiment comprised 3 battalions, each with 3 batteries of towed 10.5 and 15 centimeter guns, plus an anti-tank battalion of 3.7 centimeter pieces. By 1944, the regiment had been considerably modernized. The 1st Battalion now had 10.5 centimeter self-propelled guns. In addition, they fielded the more powerful 15 centimeter Hummel. The 2nd and 3rd Battalions still retained their towed artillery. The Panzer Division of 1941 also had a dedicated anti-tank battalion with 30 towed 7.5 centimeter Pak 40 guns. By 1944, this battalion was almost completely self-propelled. 2 companies now had a mixture of Hetzers, Jagdpanzer IVs or Jagdpanthers. 1 company still kept the towed Pak 40s. In 1941, the Reconnaissance Battalion had 2 armoured car companies, plus a motorcycle company, equipped with motorcycle combinations, armed with machine guns and light mortars. By 1944, the battalion was fully mechanized with improved armoured cars. The motorcycles had by now been chiefly relegated to the infantry divisions. 2 days before D-Day, Hitler learned that the Allied armies had captured Rome. It was not a good omen of things to come. On the 6th of June 1944, the long-awaited Allied invasion struck. The landing beaches were between Caen and the base of the Cherbourg Peninsula in Normandy. Rommel had been right. Over the first 24 hours, despite initial problems on the American beaches, the Allies poured in over 150,000 men of the US 1st and British 2nd Army. Initially, the German response seemed paralyzed. When the first reports of the Allied landings reached Hitler's staff in Berchtesgaden in the early hours of the 6th of June, they refused to wake the Führer. It wasn't until noon that Hitler appeared. He still remained convinced it could be a false alarm or diversion. He seemed even more set on his preconceived conviction that the enemy was trying to mislead him. On the ground, one Panzer officer stated that most units didn't receive a single order from the higher formations, though a few acted on their own initiative. When von Rundstedt did finally acknowledge that this was the invasion proper, he issued an impossible command. The beachhead must be cleaned up by not later than tonight. Communications themselves also presented a problem. Pre-invasion bombing had destroyed many of the German telephone landlines, and virtual Allied air supremacy over Normandy meant that anything that moved on the roads, such as dispatch riders, was liable to attack. The Germans now began to bring forward Panzer divisions of the 1st Waffen-SS Panzer Corps from as far afield as Antwerp in Belgium to engage in the battle for Normandy. As the Allies poured more and more men and equipment ashore after D-Day to secure the beachheads, disaster struck Panzer Group West. Gerd von Scheppenburg's newly established headquarters at Lequesne, east of Sandoz, had been discovered by Allied intelligence. On the 10th of June, Mitchell medium bombers and Typhoon fighter bombers struck the headquarters. The Typhoon was a large aircraft, 3 times the size of a Spitfire. It was armed with 4 20mm cannon and under-wing racks for 8 rockets or 2 500-pound bombs. The attack was successful, wounding the general and killing 18 of his staff. Headquarter vehicles parked nearby were gutted and communications equipment destroyed. So bad was the damage that the headquarters was rendered non-operational and withdrawn to Paris. The attack destroyed the only Western German army organization capable of handling a large number of mobile divisions. As part of the Allied invasion plans, the French resistance, or FFI, les Forces Françaises de l'Intérieur, had been instructed to sabotage the transport system behind the German lines and tie down units which could be used to reinforce the Normandy front. Typical of such operations occurred during the 400-mile movement of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich from Montauban in southern France towards Normandy. Das Reich had been in almost constant action since the start of the war. During their march north, they were attacked at least 15 times by the FFI. One of their officers, Sturmbannführer Helmut Kempfer, had been kidnapped and killed, and Das Reich made brutal reprisals at Ordre-sur-Glane. Here, on the 10th of June, the entire town was destroyed. and the 642 inhabitants massacred. Such diversions, however, delayed their deployment to the front to repel the invasion, where the fighting for the Normandy beachheads was severe, particularly in the British Second Army's sector around the city of Caen. On the 13th of June, a week after D-Day, Hitler launched the first of his vengeance weapons, the Fiesler 103 V1 against London. The V1, nicknamed the Doodlebug or Diver by the Allies, was the first mass-produced cruise missile in history. Powered by a ramjet engine and carrying a 1,800-pound warhead, the Doodlebug's range was about 150 miles. Launched on a compass bearing, the V1 was guided by an autopilot, which once over its target, commanded the flying bomb to make a steep diving attack. Allied aircraft guns had difficulty in shooting down these small, fast targets, but Allied fighters had greater success. If they could catch them, they tried to fly alongside the missile and tip it over with their wings. If they couldn't catch up with the missile, then they would attack with cannon fire, but the V1 still presented an elusive target. Despite the relative success of bringing terror to the civilian population of London and southern England, it did not affect the ongoing struggle in Normandy. The German armour was now fully in action, and they did not lack successes in the battle with the Allies. Panzerkampfwagen 6 Tiger tanks of the German army were not normally allocated to the Panzer divisions. 45 Tigers were nominally grouped together as heavy tank battalions and kept as independent units under Corps command. However, these battalions were often permanently attached to a specific Panzer division. One such formation was SS Panzer Abteilung 101. In the spring of 1944, this unit was formed from the 13th Company of the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte. On the 13th of June, the unit's Hauptsturmführer, Michael Wittmann, led an ambush of elements of the 4th County of London Yeomanry during the Battle of Villiers-Bocage, southwest of Caen. The Tigers of his company destroyed between 10 and 15 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 personnel carriers within the space of 15 minutes. Wittmann was one of the top German tank commanders of the war, with 138 tanks and 132 anti-tank guns to his credit. He was to die in his Tiger at the beginning of August. American troops were by now driving north from the Utah beachhead, and by the 20th of June had invested Cherbourg. Hitler knew the port was vital to the Allies for landing heavy equipment. On the 17th, he had issued the order that Cherbourg was to be held as long as possible. Normandy is not to be spoken of as the enemy's bridgehead, but as the last piece of enemy-occupied France. The enemy will not last out the summer. They've already committed all their battle-experienced divisions to Normandy, which suggests they have had their hands full. When the German commander, Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schleben, finally surrendered on the 28th of June, he and his staff were reported to be drunk. This would have been the final straw for a teetotal Hitler. Further to the south, in the Saint-Lô-Carenton sector, the 6th Fallschirm Regiment, paratroops now fighting as regular infantry, and the 17th Panzer Grenadier Division were in action together. Their objective was to prevent the Americans from expanding their lodgement area around Omaha and Utah beaches. This fighting in the bocage or hedgerows of Normandy was to be sustained and vicious until Allied manpower overwhelmed them. But before that, they had considerable success with their Panzerfaust and Panzerschrecks and the Stug 4 self-propelled tank hunters. In early July, Hitler issued the directive, "I flatly forbid any withdrawal from Caen. The present lines are to be held. All further enemy penetrations are to be stopped by determined defence or by limited counterattacks." Von Rundstedt, who was having enough difficulty countering the Allied advances, was totally exasperated by the Führer's diktat. As the Allies poured more and more men and equipment ashore, he urged Hitler and the OKW to "make peace, you idiots." On the 7th of July, Hitler immediately replaced von Rundstedt with Generalfeldmarschall Gunther Hans von Kluge as Commander-in-Chief West. He was known to his colleagues as Clever Hans. He would have to be. Hans von Kluge came from an old Prussian military family. He had served at Verdun during the First World War and led the German Fourth Army into Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. He was a brilliant staff officer and an energetic field commander. He was also non-Nazi rather than anti-Nazi, but he was politically naive. On the 9th of July, Caen finally fell to the Allies. The Allied air power over Normandy continued to pound the German forces as they attempted to beat back the invaders. Resupply and reinforcement by rail, road and canal was constantly under attack. On the 17th, when returning from a meeting with his commanders, Rommel's staff car was strafed and he suffered a major wound to the head. 3 days later, treachery struck at the heart of the Third Reich. Disaffected German officers detonated a bomb at Hitler's headquarters, narrowly missing but badly shaking the Führer. His long-held distrust of the German officer class had been confirmed. On the 24th of July, the Allies started their breakout from the Normandy beachheads. The British began the attack northeastward up the Channel coast. The Americans stuck to the south towards Avranches and Rennes, and then turned east to drive on to Argenton. On the 7th of August, von Kluge ordered a counterattack by 4 divisions against the Americans in Mortain. Once again, Typhoons were in action, catching the 2nd Panzer Division on the road in daylight and destroying many of its vehicles. The ferocious fighting continued, but after 3 days the Germans were forced to retire eastward, followed by the Americans. More bad news reached the Führer on the 15th of August. The US 7th Army and the 1st Free French Army had landed over 175,000 men on the Mediterranean coast between Nice and Toulon, opening up a second front in France. The Allied objective was to punch north towards the German border and prevent the escape of the remaining German forces in France. The Allies advanced rapidly up the valley of the River Rhone. Here, Allied fighter bombers harassed the retreating German Army Group G all the way. On the 25th of August, the Germans made a stand at Montélimar. They were overwhelmed by superior American forces who trapped one complete Panzer division and elements of two other divisions. The road to Germany was now open. Now faced with two battlefronts in France and unable to carry out the Führer's orders of no more retreats, on the 17th of August, Hans von Kluge was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. The next day, von Kluge committed suicide. He had been implicated in, but was not a party to, the July plot against Hitler. Walter Model came from a non-military family and served as an infantry officer during World War I. Between the war, he remained in the army. He had gained a reputation as a capable officer with great potential, but also as a man of ambition and drive. His dislike of bureaucracy and his crude speech often made him well liked by his troops. During the early campaigns in the Soviet Union, Walter Model had commanded various German army groups with great courage and competence. Nicknamed Hitler's fireman, he was probably the Wehrmacht's best defensive tactician. Walter Model seemed to be the right man for the current situation. And his defensive skills would be needed immediately because the Allies were now attempting to trap his main force around Falaise, south of Caen. In a huge pincer movement, the Canadian First Army was advancing from the north, while the American Third Army attacked from the south and west, intent on closing the Falaise pocket. Finally, on the 19th of August, the Allies completed the encirclement of the Falaise pocket. A number of German units, totaling 20,000 men, did manage to fight their way out, but leaving most of their heavy equipment behind. Historians differ in their estimates of German losses, but between 80 and 100,000 troops were caught in the pocket. The 12th SS Panzer Division had lost 94% of its armour, nearly all of its artillery, and 70% of its vehicles. In fairness to Model, he had only assumed command 2 days before the Falaise trap was closed, but the huge loss of men and equipment meant that organized German defense was now impossible. The road to Paris and the north was now wide open. To the north, the British were driving towards the River Seine, while the Americans' target was Paris. Since 1940, the French capital had been considered as a playground for the German military, where troops could rest and recuperate. The Paris garrison was commanded by a general of infantry, Dietrich von Choltitz. Von Choltitz had served as an infantry officer during the First World War and had remained in the military between the wars as a cavalry officer. During the early part of the war, he had served in Holland at Sevastopol in the Crimea. On the 19th of August, the FFI resistance staged an uprising. There was bitter street fighting, but by the 22nd, all Paris's public buildings were in their hands. On the 23rd, the Führer ordered that the city must not fall into the enemy's hands except lying in complete debris. To reinforce this, one account says that Hitler telephoned von Choltitz in a rage, screaming, "Is Paris burning?" For political reasons, the Allies decided that General Leclerc's 2nd French Armored Division, supported by the US 4th Division, should be the first to enter Paris. On the 24th of August, they were greeted enthusiastically by the civilian population. but there were still pockets of German resistance to be cleared out. With the centre of Paris in Allied hands, Dietrich von Choltitz must have known that his fate was already sealed, and he was highly unlikely ever to see Hitler again. He therefore didn't even attempt to raze the city to the ground. Following his capture by the Allies, he admitted to executing the most difficult order of my life in Russia, the liquidation of the Jews. Nonetheless, I've executed this order in its entirety. Given his record on the Eastern Front, his refusal to obey the Führer's orders during the liberation of Paris is remarkable. The next day, he formally surrendered the 17,000 men under his command to General Leclerc. Not unexpectedly, after 4 years of occupation, the treatment of German troops and their French collaborators was going to be harsh. Finally, the same day, the leader of the Free French, General Charles de Gaulle, entered the city, and the liberation of Paris had been achieved. During the summer of 1944, the battles on Germany's eastern and western fronts had been nothing short of disastrous. Between June and August 1944, the Germans had lost almost 1.25 million men dead, wounded, or missing. Field Marshal Walter Model's concept of being reluctant to give ground, although not completely refusing withdrawal, together with the importance of not allowing major enemy breakthroughs, began to pay dividends. This meant Allied advance into Belgium and Holland during the early autumn of 1944 was slow and the fighting bitter. In order to maintain the tempo of the advance, the Allies developed a highly optimistic plan. Operation Market Garden was a combined land and airborne operation to seize the bridges over the canals in southern Holland and over the rivers Maas, Waal and the Lower Rhine. Operation Market planned for 3 simultaneous airborne landings on the 17th of September. The first was to be by the American 101st Airborne Division over the canals north of Eindhoven at Zoon and Wegel. The second drop was to be at Grave on the Maas by the American 82nd Airborne Division. They were then to strike north and take the bridge at Nijmegen. The 1st British Airborne Division, later to be reinforced by the 1st Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, would land furthest north at Arnhem. Operation Garden proposed that the British 30 Corps advance rapidly over the captured bridges to Arnhem. It was intended they achieved this in 3 days. They thereby hoped to prevent the German forces in the Netherlands from escaping back to Germany and ensure an Allied thrust into northern Germany. The war could be over by the end of 1944. Field Marshal Walter Model had his headquarters to the west of Arnhem when the British began to land in the surrounding countryside. Initially, he concluded that these were commandos attempting to kidnap him. He made a rapid dash to the nearby headquarters of Lieutenant General Wilhelm Dietrich. Unknown to Allied intelligence, elements of Dietrich's 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions were refitting in the Eindhoven-Arnhem area. Dietrich had served as an army officer and as a fighter pilot during the First World War. In 1939, he joined the Waffen-SS and commanded a regiment in Poland in 1939 and in France in 1940. He was later promoted to divisional and corps command. Strangely for a Waffen-SS general, as the war progressed, his loathing of the Nazi hierarchy increased. Willy Dietrich was also known as the most sarcastic man in Germany. He recounted, I once spent an hour and a half trying to explain a situation to SS General Sepp Dietrich with the aid of a map. It was quite useless. He understood nothing at all. Even before Modell's arrival at his headquarters, Dietrich had dispatched armoured units to reinforce the bridge at Nijmegen. The British 1st Airborne Division had been forced to land 6 miles west of Arnhem because there were no suitable drop or landing areas closer to the town. They now had to fight their way into the town against growing German resistance. Elements of the 2nd Battalion, 1st Parachute Brigade did manage to reach the northern edge of the bridge over the Rhine, but were pinned down in the town by Dietrich's troops and armour. One of the remarkable quirks of fate for the Allied troops landing at Arnhem was that, unknown to them, the father of German paratroops, Generaloberst Kurt Student, had his headquarters at Vught, about 30 miles from the town. Of all the men the Allied airborne troops least wanted to encounter was Student, who well knew the limitations on heavy equipment and resupply the British and Polish airborne troops were likely to face. During World War I, Kurt Student served in the Air Force. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not allowed an air force, but Student remained in the army. He also attended the Soviet Army Air Force's maneuvers, where he first came into contact with the concept of airborne assault. In January 1941, Student was named Commanding General of the 11th Fliegerkorps, the newly formed command for the expanding German airborne forces. His troops had made the descent on the Corinth Canal in Greece on the island of Crete in 1941. Though the landings had been highly successful, because of heavy casualties, Hitler forbade any more massed airborne landings. Kurt Student's Fallschirmjäger would in future fight as conventional infantry. To the south, on the 18th of September, British 30 Corps armour had linked up with the 101st Airborne Division, who had successfully secured the bridges at Zorn and Wegel. But as 30 Corps pressed north along the road to Grave and Nijmegen, they were constantly delayed by attacks from Dietrich's panzers and anti-tank weapons. It became known as Hell's Highway. It took them almost a day to cover the 20 miles before they joined the 82nd Airborne Division north of Grave. Dietrich's defences south of Waal at Nijmegen had prevented the Americans from taking the bridge there. Against Dietrich's advice, Field Marshal Model had ordered that the bridge, which was already fitted with demolition charges, should not be blown in case he needed to reinforce his units still fighting to the south of the river. With the bridge still in German hands, 30 Corps and the 82nd Airborne were further delayed for almost 48 hours, while boats were brought up and an assault made across the river. When the bridge was finally captured intact, the charges were removed by Allied sappers as the armour crossed. But the race to reach the British on the bridge at Arnhem was already too late. Elements of the 10th SS Panzer Division still held the southern end of the bridge. To the west of the bridge at Arnhem, the British 1st Airborne Division was having an horrific time. On the 18th, their second airlift of men and equipment had been attacked as they came into their landing ground. The Polish Parachute Brigade, much delayed because of bad weather, landed on the 22nd. The British defence perimeter was now under constant attack and shrinking. But this arrival of reinforcements only delayed the end at Arnhem. 2 days later, on the night of the 24th, 25th of September, after 9 days fighting, the surviving British and Polish troops were withdrawn across the Rhine. Of the original 10,000 troops landed, only 3,000 made the crossing. Despite his victory, General Blitzkrieg was furious. His 2nd Tank Corps had virtually wiped out a British airborne division. During the fighting, he had permitted the enemy to run a field hospital situated behind the German lines. But Nazi Party functionaries had taken it upon themselves to kill British and American pilots, and Blitzkrieg was cast in the role of a liar. The defeat of the British and Poles at Arnhem only delayed the inevitable. Model, despite his defensive skills, was unable to prevent the Allies from driving towards the German frontier. In the closing months of 1944, with the Western Allies advancing from the west and the Russians from the east, Hitler was faced with an ever-shrinking area of Europe which he controlled. The enemy had broken through the gates of his fortress Europe and were poised to enter the fatherland.